I'm Lisa from Pink Holly Bush Designs. Welcome back to Make Your Daughter a Dress. Today is lesson 10. As I think you can see, the sun is shining, the daffodils are finally starting to come up, the snow is gone, and we are getting near the end of our dress. So today we're going to get that bodice and skirt attached, and you're actually going to get a chance to see what your dress looks like. So let's get started sewing. So I've started with my bodice and I've pinned my lining up out of the way. And the next thing I'm going to do is get my glue basted. And I'm going to just take a little bit. I'm going to push that piping, or if you didn't pipe, it's the seam allowance, and I'm pushing it to the wrong side so that I have a nice finished edge here. And I'm going to put one of my clips on and just let that dry for a minute. Now, if you don't have the glue basted, fold your seam allowance, the side seam allowance, to the wrong side. Take your needle and thread and just stitch a few stitches there to hold it. And I'm going to do the same thing over here on this side. And notice I'm not getting the lining. We're not going to work with that right now, but I'm making sure I've got a nice finished edge here. All right, now we're going to let the glue dry for a few minutes, but while it does, I can start pinning my bodice and skirt front together. So the first thing I'm going to do is line up my side seams, and I'm going to make sure that I'm not catching my basting thread. But I want to get those two seams lined perfectly up. So I'm putting right sides together, and I'm going to go through the seam allowance of the bodice and make sure I go right through that seam of the side seam. I'm going to do that with my other one. And then I'm also going to match center front. If you remember, we clipped both of the center front on both the bodice and the skirt so I can find them. And then I'm going to adjust my gathers to match. So there's the clip. And there's the clip. Whoops, I'm going to use a clip for this. Okay, and then I'm just going to pull, I'm going to find those two basting threads. And they're the bobbin threads, not the front ones. And I'm just going to adjust those gathers to match up to my to the length of the bodice. Okay. Do that on the other side as well. Okay, so there's my bodice front. Now on my bodice back, you have a finished edge, and that's why we had to clip this back, because it needs to be finished edge to finished edge. And I'm just slipped the clip off there and re-clipped it. And now again, I'm going to use those bobbin threads, and I'm going to pull up my bodice back to match let me redo that. I'm gonna pull up my skirt back to match my bodice back. Now before you sew this, open it out. Just kind of look, make sure that the gathers look like they're nicely lying there nice. They don't look like they're too over gathered in one spot, not in the other. I'm going to go to my machine and I'm going to stitch right on top of this line of stitching that's already there, and that is from where my piping was attached. So I'm going to use that as my guideline. If you didn't pipe the waist, so there is no guideline, then you can stitch from the skirt side and use that 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you might see something like that. And you'll be going in between the two lines of gathering threads. Okay, let's make sure that our waist there is opened up. Okay, I've got this one opened, and you're going to stitch back tack at both edges and stitch from back to back. Right, I'm here at my machine. I'm using my number 3 Bernina foot, which has a groove under it, but you probably want to use your piping foot or your zipper foot. If that doesn't let you see what you need to see, try a regular foot, but the idea is to be able to stitch right over that previous line of stitching, assuming you piped the waist. If you didn't and you were just sewing the two together, then by all means just use your regular, you're sewing the bodice and the skirt together and there's no piping, just use your regular all-purpose foot. So just a couple tricks as you're sewing along on this waist. Don't take your pin out at each of the side seams until you are right there. In fact, if you go slow, you could even stitch over the pin. I don't usually like to do that. Make sure you won't hit the pin and break a needle, but you really want to not separate those so that those side seams perfectly line up. A second tip as you're stitching is to keep gently pulling your skirt straight. That way your gathers will look nice and you won't end up with them folded over or bunched up together. Okay, I'm coming up on this other end, and again you want to make sure that those just line up perfectly and stitch right up. And then back tack. Okay, before you start clipping threads, turn everything to the right side. Take a look. Make sure you're lined up here at the edge. Make sure you didn't catch your piping anywhere, that you don't have your gathers folded, that everything looks nice the way you like it. Yeah, and it seems to me that I'm pretty happy with that. And now you're going to go through and you're going to clip all these threads that are hanging. The other thing you want to look for is, do you have any of your gathering thread showing? And you should. You probably can't see it because I used the same color thread, but that's one of my bobbin gathering threads right there. And so you want to take your seam ripper and just go along. It's a gathering thread, so it should come out fairly easily, and just get those all cleaned out. So right now, the next thing to do is to just go around and clip all these threads and get everything cleaned up. I just love how this little dress is starting to turn out. Isn't that pop of color just perfect there? Once you are happy you've trimmed everything, you like how your gathers look, what you want to do is, again, go to the inside here, and we're just going to trim this entire seam down to 1/4 of an inch, and then zigzag across the whole thing using that regular zigzag stitch where you go right off the edge, just to overcast it all together and give a nice finish. If you have a serger, this is the perfect place to just go ahead and serge across this entire seam. I've serged my edge. Zigzagging is fine as well. At this point now I'm going to go to the iron and press this entire seam towards the bodice. And at this point we're going to unpin that lining and we're going to bring it down onto our dress. Start by matching the side seams up and pinning those in place. Your lining with that fold, remember we pressed in so long ago, should just cover your bottom line of stitching. Now if you're looking at your skirt, or I should say your dress, and you went into a complete panic thinking, Lisa, how long is this skirt? When you saw it put together, don't panic. We are doing the tuck hem finish on this to finish the hem, and that will be our last lesson. But there's a 6-inch hem allowance on this dress in order to be able to do the tuck hem. So I promise you it will not be too long. Alright, and I'm going to continue. Now I'm going to attach this lining by using that same slip stitch that I showed you on the placket. A lot of times patterns will tell you to stitch in the ditch to do this. I have never found that that works well. I usually end up with a mess that needs to be ripped out. So again, I like to just take a couple minutes. It's a lot less work, and just hand stitch it. But I'll show you what I mean by stitching in the ditch. So the way they would do that is to pin the lining like I did, and then with your machine, go back and stitch right up against the piping, right through those gathers, stitching along here with the idea that you're catching that lining in the back. Like I said, I just don't see how you're not going to see that on the front, and half the time it catches the lining on the back and half the time it doesn't. So my preference is to just hand stitch this lining, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, I've got my all-purpose thread, and I've threaded up one of those sharps, and I've knotted it, and I've run it through the beeswax a few times. If you don't have beeswax, that's fine, don't worry about it. Right, and I'm going to just come up in that lining so that I can bury my knot in between those two. And I'm going to do a couple little whip stitches just right here to really get it anchored in that right there at the edge. And I made sure that I really pulled that lining to the wrong side so that I have a nice finished edge here on the right side. And then with that slip stitch, you're going to get a couple threads of the skirt fabric, go down as close as you can to where you just took those threads, and then travel through the fold of the lining fabric. So again, straight up, get a couple threads of the skirt fabric into the fold of the lining and travel through the fold of the lining. That was kind of a little bit of a bigger one, but that's okay. And once you get to the actual skirt, because of all those gathers, even if you take a little chunk of the, skirt fabric, it will not show on the right hand side. So get some threads, go through the lining, and come out. And you're just going to do that across the whole waist. So here's that finished lining all stitched down, and you have a nice, beautiful inside that's going to be soft against your daughter, and she's not going to have anything that's causing itching or scratching or hurting. So that's all you need to do for today. Get your lining attached, or your bodice attached to your skirt, and your lining stitched down. I will be back with the next lesson, and all we have left to do are making our buttonholes and sewing on our buttons, and then hemming our dress. So I will see you soon. Happy sewing.